This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and it is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group. The Democracy Group is a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. I have a big announcement. I've shared this on a few episodes already. We are on Patreon. Join us on Patreon. It gives you access to our moderated community. It's a chat. We can chat with each other. You can talk with me. You can talk with others who've been on the program. And at higher levels, you'll get access to exclusive TPNR merch. We got coffee mugs. We got, what else we got? Tote bags. We got all kinds of stuff. And there's ad-free episodes too. You also have the ability to give input and even receive director credits on upcoming episodes. Just go to patreon.com/politicsandreligion. That's patreon.com/politicsandreligion. And as always, remember, keep writing those reviews. If you've written a review, then create a new profile and write another review. We need reviews. The links to the Patreon and an easy way to write that review, it's all in our show notes. It really does help so we can continue having great conversations like the one we're having today about a recent kerfuffle some of you might have heard about involving the Presbyterian Church in America and David French, one of my favorite writers, thinkers. So for today's edition, I'll be doing something a little different. I'm going to be reading extensively from other reports and commentary. Just so you can hear, I'll be talking obviously, but I'm going to be reading longer stretches of this stuff so you can hear what people actually say. You can hear the evidence, if you will, and hear a fuller context for yourselves. So I'll just start with a news summary just to give you a quick report on what actually happened, the David French PCA thing. This is from a news article in the Roy's Report by Bob Smetana, a national reporter for Religion News Service. He said, the Presbyterian Church in America, aka also known as the PCA, canceled a recently announced panel on helping pastors deal with polarization, saying the topic was too divisive. Leaders of the PCA had announced the panel in, I think it was in early May, titled How to Be Supportive of Your Pastor and Church Leaders in a Polarized Political Year. So again, the name of this seminar or the panel was How to Be Supportive of Your Pastor and Church Leaders in a Polarized Political Year. And then Smetana goes on to report the inclusion of author and New York Times columnist David French, a longtime PCA member who recently left the denomination, led to online outrage. Critics, and Smetana does point out that many were from outside the PCA, but there are plenty that were from within the church, which I'll be talking about today. Critics labeled French, best known for his vocal opposition to Donald Trump, as liberal and divisive, and accused PCA leaders of trying to cause rancor and controversy over politics. So that's the summary. That's the report. Critics labeled French liberal and divisive. Liberal. David French is liberal? On what planet is David French liberal? We sort of know the answer. When the definition of liberal is simply anyone who doesn't want to lick the boots of Donald frickin' Trump, let's just call it what it is. That's all it is. It's a bespoke reality, a concept we'll be discussing a lot more in the conversation we have coming up with Renee DiRista. I'm very excited about that one, by the way. A bespoke reality that's no longer connected to actual reality. Because anyone who's covered David French's career and read anything he's written, not some headline, not some proof-texted mischaracterization of something he said, but has taken the time to actually digest his work and understand his views and contributions, no rational, objective, remotely knowledgeable person would consider David French liberal. Not that there would be anything wrong with that, as I've mentioned many times in the past, unless he's not actually liberal. And unless you're defining liberal by anyone who chooses to question the particular practices of worship around Donald Trump that have now become expected in order to earn your not a liberal club card. But I'm already off to the races. So let me back up and take a closer look at what the hell happened. I figured it'd be worthwhile to dive into one of the more prominent commentaries that gained a lot of traction within the denomination, within the PCA. And I'll be candid about my working theories here as to where this attack is actually coming from and what it's all about. So this particular take, I'll call it a canceling, if you will. Like a number of others I've seen, it starts with a loyalty to a particular side in a perceived culture war. And that is the pro-Trump, the anti-left. That's the entire, that's it. That's the entire orienting factor, the true north by which all compasses are set. I hate the left, or that which I perceive to be the dreaded left. And we're the good guys. Trump is our guy. Never question or even hint at going against the good guys. That's it. That's what it starts with. So with those as your defining principles, we hate the left. We're the good guys. Now shut the hell up about it. And that's it. With that as the core of your highest, most defining values, it means you gotta, in this guy, the report that I'm going to be reading, you got to back scriptural arguments, albeit strained and disfigured arguments, into that default posture of malice, which then necessitates dishonesty to advance a position that was already predetermined. So, for a better understanding of exactly how David French, someone who has an incredible record and life of service, how he got canceled from this event, the attack I'll be looking at is from Ben Dunson's May 9th piece just this year in American Reformer. Ben Dunson is an editor of American Reformer, a journal, as well as like a magazine. He's also a teaching elder, which is basically a minister of the Presbyterian Church in America. So after introducing himself in this piece, he says, "I am utterly dismayed to see the name of David French, who is not even a member of a PCA congregation." Who is not even a member of a PCA congregation. Dunson, that's what he says. So before I even have to go any further, I just got to pause right there. Whether David's membership in the church is a disqualifier for a panel like this is debatable in any denomination. But either way, Dunson is dropping in this little tidbit as part of his overall objective, which is basically to disqualify David French from this sort of event. So what's the real story here? The real story about whether the Frenches are or were members of the PCA, it's actually a little different than what Dunson is trying to mislead his readers to believe. David and Nancy have shared their experiences publicly before, so it's not hard to find information about this. But just a couple of weeks ago, David wrote a piece for the New York Times where he went into some detail about it. So this is from his June 9th, 2024 column, just a couple of weeks ago. He said, "Our family joined the PCA denomination in 2004. We lived in Philadelphia and attended 10th Presbyterian Church in Center City. At the time, the denomination fit us perfectly. I'm a conservative theologically and politically. And in 2004, I was still a partisan Republican." He goes on to describe a great experience, many great experiences actually that he had with his church and friends from church, like when they moved to Tennessee and their church family helped them settle in, or when David was deployed to Iraq and just going through life together, like much of my own experiences, or at least my best experiences in the church. But he describes how things started to change for them sometime around 2015, specifically when Trump came on the scene. So David went on to say, "I was a senior writer for National Review at the time, and when I wrote pieces critical of Trump, members of the alt-right pounced, and they attacked us through our daughter, who's black." I'll share more about that in a little bit. He said they pulled pictures of their daughter from social media and photoshopped her into gas chambers and lynchings. Trolls found my wife's blog on a religious website called Pathos and filled the comment section with gruesome pictures of dead and dying Black victims of crime and war. We also received direct threats. We began encountering racism and hatred up close from people in our church and in our church school. The racism was grotesque. He goes on to say, including a student telling my daughter that slavery was good for black people because it taught them how to live in America. Another told her that she couldn't come to our house to play because my dad said black people are dangerous. Later in the piece, he said a church elder came up to my wife and me after one service to criticize our opposition to Trump and told me to get your wife under control after she contrasted his support for Trump with his opposition to Bill Clinton over the Monica Lewinsky affair. Another man confronted me at the communion table. And then a little bit after that, he said, there is a faction of explicitly authoritarian Christian nationalists in the church, and some of that Christian nationalism has disturbing racial elements underpinning it. So, yeah, you could simply just leave it at David French is not even a member of a PCA congregation and just leave it at that. Or you could be honest. By leaving out any context, it is straight up lying by what this writer omits. You know, I'll give him a little tiny bit of credit because he does include hyperlinks to various articles that he's referring to. But just, I mean, I also often say this to guys in the church when they're having a Bible study. Let's keep reading. You know, so when it's called proof texting with the Bible, I say to Dunson now, let's keep reading. We can't stop with the half of a verse that you've strategically extricated from its proper context in order to fit your prejudices, which were all decided before this inquiry ever even started. But more to the point, since Dunson is a professed Christian, it is worth pointing out that what we have here is a failure to communicate. No, what we have here is a ninth commandment problem. The ninth commandment in the Bible, for those who aren't, don't have it memorized, it says, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. It's in a couple different places actually in the Torah, just to make sure we didn't miss it. It's in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. But let's keep reading, as I said. Let's keep reading Dunson's piece to see what else he has an objection to. One of his complaints is that French has written and spoken defending drag queen story hour. Now, setting aside what anyone believes, either legally or religiously, about so-called drag queen story hour, my point here is to see if what Dunson is saying is accurate, and if not, what David French has actually said about this. I mean, let's just call it what it is. It's a boogeyman that some crackpots are setting up to scare the crap out of their readers or followers or listeners or whatever. But I just want to stay focused. What did David French actually say on drag queen story hour? So I took this from a New Yorker piece in September of 2019 by Benjamin Wallace Wells. He recounted a public conversation between David and a young conservative named Sohrab Ahmari. So he says, quote, Ahmari kept returning to the extremist complaint that drag queen story hours are being staged for children in public libraries. To him, these were a sign of a 5-alarm cultural fire. French, who spent years as a litigator, replied that he had never understood what Ahmari wanted the government to do about drag queen story hour, which tenets of local control or free speech he would have the Trump administration set aside. The same First Amendment principle that allows drag queens to read to children in public libraries had also allowed Christian groups to flourish, French said, by permitting them to organize in universities and other public spaces. So you would undermine viewpoint neutrality in First Amendment jurisprudence? French asked. Yeah, I would, Ahmari said. French raised his arms in exasperation. That's a disaster, y'all. And I could hear his voice as he says it. The writer also points out that David spent most of his career working as a religious liberty attorney, representing small evangelical congregations and religious professors at secular colleges. He took a break from his work to serve as an army officer in Iraq and over time became a prominent conservative writer. So again, Dunson can oversimplify the whole matter. And this is my commentary, by the way. I don't know if it's clear when I'm quoting and when it's just my commentary, but Dunson can oversimplify this whole thing and say David French was just writing and speaking in defense of drag queen story hour. and also pretend that he hasn't spent a career defending the free speech and religious rights of small evangelical congregations and pastors. And like, regardless of how you feel about this kind of, like, it's a clickbaity topic. When David's spoken or written about it, his bona fides and what he stands for come through very clearly. He's an advocate for the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and yes, the freedom of religion, balanced by the Establishment Clause. In other words, he's a defender of the basic liberties enshrined in the Constitution, while at the same time having his own religious convictions and that inform his beliefs in those freedoms. So while David's positions, it's always thought-provoking. It gives me a lot to consider. There's so much nuance there that causes me to think through my own theological views and how my theology informs my position on these social and political issues. Dunson, on the other hand, he just oversimplifies. And by oversimplifying, he mischaracterizes as a way to vilify. In other words, he bears false witness. So getting back to a scriptural, again, I know not all of you are Jewish or Christian or believe in the Bible, but this guy is a professed Christian, so it's worth keep on going back to the authority he says he submits to. So it's not just in the Torah where we get that. We see, I love the Gospels, I love the Jesus stories. So we see Jesus in at least 3 of the Gospels referring to bearing false witness. So like there's one story where he's talking to a rich young ruler who asks him what he has to do to have eternal life. So the one I'll take from is in Matthew 19. When the young ruler asks Jesus this question, first of all, Jesus responds. Oftentimes, Jesus responds to a question by asking another question, which I love. But he gets around to saying, if you would enter life, keep the commandments. To which the young ruler said to him, which ones? And Jesus said, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness. So this bearing false witness thing is all over the Bible. And that's exactly what Mr. Dunson is doing. Unfortunately, Mr. Dunson, we haven't even read, 100 words of this complaint he submitted from this position of authority that he's in. And we're already seeing this pattern emerging. And it ain't a pattern that aligns with the Bible, what the Bible would have us say or do. But let's keep reading. Dunson also complained he has done the same in support of the legalization of so-called gay marriage. Again, I'm not going to comment on Dunson's use of the term so-called gay marriage. There's plenty to discuss there. But my focus is on the fact that he's characterizing David French's words and views a certain way as a way to cancel him and take him down. So what has David French actually said? And there are plenty of places where we can get a sense of his positions and what he's focused on, but I'll just pull from one of the pieces Dunson links, which I give him, again, some credit for linking to, but are we not supposed to actually read it? Anyway, this is from David's November 18th, 2022 piece in The Atlantic, stating his own position as if he were answering Justice Alito's question to the Solicitor General regarding a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. So I'll start with Justice Alito's question. He said, in the Bob Jones case, the court held that a college was not entitled to tax-exempt status if it opposed interracial marriage or interracial dating. So would the same apply to a university or a college if it opposed same-sex marriage? That's what Alito asked. And David French shared how he would have answered that question. So we have a pretty clear view on what his position is. And he said, so David French said he would have answered this way, quote, the government does not view the traditional teachings of the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and the vast majority of the Protestant Church to be the equivalent of white supremacy, and the government has a fundamental and overriding interest in protecting the free exercise of religion, end quote. Again, leaving aside the merits of the issue, whether you're in favor of gay marriage or still opposed, my line of question is that it has everything to do with whether Ben Dunson, a leader in the Presbyterian Church in America and an editor of a very influential publication, has accurately represented David French's views, which we can clearly see he has not, mostly by way of mischaracterization as a way to vilify, demonize, and ironically enough, to get him canceled. And before I shift gears, let's look at just one more of Dunson's charges against David French. He says, French called a law like the one in Texas that would investigate parents who subject their children to chemical or surgical mutilation of their sexual organs, so-called gender reassignment surgeries, an illiberal extreme. Okay. I have not been engaging in the politics of the legislation so far because while it's worth delving into all of that. But this exploration, this inquiry is specifically about the PCA's canceling of David French. So I wanted to focus on that, but it does need to be pointed out that Dunson's line of attack and these well-worn tactics of overly generalizing, oversimplifying, and entirely mischaracterizing in order to vilify and demonize, it's not limited to ad hominem attacks like he's doing against David. What we also see throughout his writing is the mischaracterization as a means of attacking actual legislation. Now, if you're a politician, I'm not forgiving it. I sort of get it. It's dirty politics, but it's politics. But this dude's an elder in his church. He's a church leader. And the Bible has a lot to say about that, what it means to be a leader in the church. I'll immediately go to 1 Timothy, Titus, there are some passages there. So I pulled one up in Titus here, just some of what it says for those who aren't familiar. In Titus, it says, for an overseer, you could say elder, there's different words for it, but for an overseer as God's steward must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant. Some other things it says is that they must not be greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, upright, holy, and self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine. It goes on to say, for there are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers, and deceivers, which this fella has been displaying over and over and over again, just right at the top of his damn essay. It says here in Titus that empty talkers and deceivers, they must be silenced since they are upsetting whole families by teaching for shameful gain what they ought not to teach. Shameful gain, like being the editor of a publication. And I don't know. I could talk about that, but I don't know as much about it, so I won't go too deep into it. So without going any further about this dude's hackneyed ways of mischaracterizing others' words and positions, but also actual legislation and what it really does from state to state, let's focus back on what David French has actually said on this topic. So back on October 2nd, 2022, writing for the Dispatch, David French wrote, I'm a person who believes in the traditional Christian doctrines of marriage and sexual morality. I don't believe in sex outside of marriage between a man and a woman. I'm both a traditionally Orthodox Christian and a strong believer in classical liberalism, pluralism, and legal equality. I'm a believer in those political values because I'm a traditionally Orthodox Christian. I do want to protect the fundamental freedoms of even the most strident of my political opponents. This is not because they'll like me if I do, because it is just and right to defend the rights of others that I would like to exercise myself. He goes on to say, the illiberal extremes, by contrast, offer an alluring vision for their partisans, ultimate victory and the vanquishing of their opponents. He's basically describing guys like Ben Dunson. But again, he goes on to say, but when that victory severs parent from child, it's not only unjust, it's destabilizing. States have many ways to express their values, and they can and should strictly limit access to permanent, life-altering medical procedures for minors. For example, states should pass age restrictions prohibiting dramatic medical interventions for children, and at an absolute minimum must require parental consent. But they can express their values and pass their regulations while still remembering a singular moral and constitutional command: leave loving families alone. End quote. That's David French's position on the matter. You may disagree or agree with any number of it. So as we hear what he actually has to say on this matter, what we hear, it's like a Grand Canyon-sized chasm between his actual words and the way Ben Dunson, this influential elder within the church, has tried to mischaracterize them. It's pretty disgusting when we really think about it. Not only that, if we do start to consider the merits of these two positions, whether we're looking at it as engaged American citizens or devoted Christians, there's really no comparison in terms of who's exhibiting a greater fidelity to basic principles and virtues. And again, you may still agree or disagree with aspects of what David French has spelled out, but the very least we could do is to try to digest and account for the totality of his position. And not just take a few words here and take out a few words there and pretend that he's saying something that he's not in order to suit an argument you've already decided you're going to launch against him. So what Dunson is displaying is a certain kind of superiority complex or a chauvinism, as if he owns the entire domain of what is right and wrong on all things, including biblical interpretation, on all political and social issues, on who and what we should hate, who we must attack and cancel and fight against. And part of my issue with Ben Dunson is that on the subjects he's tackling, just in this one attack he launched, he's wrong. He's flat out wrong on his interpretation of Scripture, in terms of how he's trying to impose his will as a leader in the church, in terms of his understanding. Oh, I was going to say his understanding, but his complete lack thereof of the basic rights and freedoms that we've discussed here on this program, just those in the First Amendment. But the even bigger issues I have with Ben Dunson's words and actions is that he did impose his will on the rest of the denomination. You think with blowhards like this taking up all the oxygen in any given church-wide conversation that anybody else would want to pipe up and say the kinds of things I'm saying? Absolutely not. I've been in those rooms. I've been in those churches. I've been on those email threads. And I've taken the freaking blows. If you dare to even say, hey, wait a second, I think you might be misrepresenting what our brother said. Or, I'm not sure if you've given an accurate reflection of the issue at hand. Can we think about this for a second? There's no room for even raising the question like that. The kind of barbs I had to face for even asking the question, I know this because I speak from experience. I've shared some of those stories in the past. But before I go too far down this trail, I do want to share just one more of the little grenades this guy included in his onslaught. So listen to this. Dunson said, quote, he, meaning David French, and his wife left the PCA because, as his wife put it, the PCA is brimming with neo-Confederates, end quote. He and his wife, as his wife put it. So where do I start with this? So first, it's worth noting that this dude's now attacking David French's family. He's attacking Nancy. We've had Nancy French on this program, and she's the last one to use her stage 4 cancer diagnosis as any sort of excuse, but I'll point it out. Ben Dunson, how much of a complete douche do you have to be to not only attack someone in an unfounded way, not only go on the attack against his family, but to attack his wife who is in the midst of battling stage 4 cancer? So that right there tells me a hell of a lot more about you, Ben Dunson, than anything you're trying to say about David and Nancy French. So yeah, that gets me a little hot under the collar. You know, if you heard Nancy French and heard the kind of human being that she is, the kind of character that she has, the kind of chutzpah that she's dealt with this fight of her life, literally, then you might get a little hot under the collar when somebody's throwing an unfounded charge against her too. So I'll back up and look at what Nancy actually did say. I did mention above at more length about their family's experience with the PCA, but here's what Nancy said. It's taken from an article in Deseret News by Jennifer Graham. As Jennifer Graham describes, quote, French and her husband recently left the Presbyterian Church in America for a predominantly black congregation, Strong Tower Bible Church, where the pastor is a former Christian rap musician. That's partly because their youngest daughter, adopted from Ethiopia, would feel more at home. But French told me it's also because she was tired of being accosted at the communion table by hostile people. Nancy said, after 15 years, I was just like, I can't do that anymore. The last time a neo-Confederate confronted me, I thought, I'll go to Strong Tower. No church is perfect, she said, but I doubt they're brimming with neo-Confederates. I wanted their daughter to be comfortable and to be where people were not politically acrimonious. End quote. Again, I guess if you squint and stand on one leg and pretend that only the words that suit your prejudiced argument exist and everything else that might dispute it simply doesn't exist or doesn't matter, then yeah, Maybe you could get away with what Ben Dunson says throughout this piece, let alone the rest of his journal and his work. Or you could just be honest. You could just be honest and describe what David and Nancy French have actually said, what they stand for, what their lives have represented. If you had an ounce of intellectual rigor and any sense of ethical discernment, you could reckon with what your interlocutors have actually said. Represent their positions more fully, more accurately, and more honestly, and then maybe criticize those positions. Then maybe your arguments would carry some weight. But what this individual has displayed is a lack of devotion to the truth, an intellectual and moral cowardice, an impulse to simply impose his will on the rest of the denomination based on judgments and prejudices he arrived at before he even engaged honestly and openly on this particular matter. And the really sad thing is, Ben Dunson and a small handful of hard-headed blowhards in his camp took an entire church denomination down this path with him. So yeah, this American church shows some guy who's following in the footsteps of the Crusades and not anything like the Christ we encounter in the Gospels. In this case, we know what it looks like. There's no coherent or cohesive moral, scriptural, or legal philosophy, except that it's guided by an extreme, blinding hatred of the left, as he defines it, which goes hand in hand with an equally blind devotion to Trump or Trumpism or MAGA extremism or however you want to call it. And with this hatred and rage for the left and an absolute devotion to the MAGA extremist, the silo of politics, we see how he backs scriptural arguments, albeit strained and disfigured, into that default posture of malice, which then permits or necessitates dishonesty to advance a position that was already predetermined. So if nothing else, I just wanted to take this time to take a closer look at what's been said, how it misrepresented David and Nancy French's words in order to get them canceled. Yeah, it's a canceling. This is an actual canceling. And it's a canceling from the church they belong to for so many years. For what? The mortal sin of, when it comes down to it, not any of the things that a guy like Ben Dunson was dishonestly trying to assert, but for the sin of daring to question the words, action, and character of Donald Trump. That's it. Daring to question Donald Trump's integrity, such as it is. That's what it comes down to. But as surprising as it might sound, even with all of that, I still have hope because of people like David and Nancy French. Because of people like Dr. Russell Moore and Curtis Chang, their colleagues who they co-founded the After Party with. Because the Crusades actually happened, and yet we're still here. Because the Inquisition actually happened at the hands of leaders within the church, and yet we're still here. We still have faithful Christians like Beth Moore and Pete Wehner and Lisa Sharon Harper. And it's people like my dear friend Lisa Sharon Harper and Peter and Dr. Moore and David and Nancy French that keep the faith alive, that follow more closely in the ways of Christ, in the way and the truth and the life. But now I risk sounding a little bit more like it's Sunday morning, so I'll leave that up to my pastor, and I'll just I guess I'll just wind it down there. So as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow the show and write that review. And now you can join the conversation on Patreon. It's patreon.com/politicsandreligion. That's patreon.com/politicsandreligion. Check it out, subscribe, get some TPNR swag. Really excited about that. Now go talk some politics and religion with I was going to say gentleness. I guess I haven't been gentle today. And respect. It is respectful. I can disagree and point out where somebody's going off the rails and not faithful to scripture. That is respectful in its own way, albeit not gentle. I'll admit to that. I got to confess. But when you can, talk politics and religion with gentleness and respect. And have a great week.